This model will be painted a gloss white, and because of that, the surface really needs to be about as perfect as I can make it. Gloss paint will show up every single underlying flaw in the surface. So it'll be time to fill in all these depressions. I'll be using 4 different kinds of putty. First kind, this is a local spot putty. It's white. It's fairly thick, so it does a good job of filling in the deeper depressions. I'll also be using a 3M acryl green spot putty. It's also fairly thick and good for filling in deep depressions. This tube is rather old, so I'm not sure how much more I'm going to get out of this. As you can see, I haven't used very much of it. Then I'll be using the regular old Bondo glazing and spot putty. It's a little bit thinner, better for smaller depressions. And then finally, there is another green automotive spot putty. It's here in Taiwan. I've run out of it, so I have to buy some more. But it'll be the thinnest of the putties, and it's good for a finishing top coat, if you will. The first putty and sand is completed. You can see here now I'll use the black guide coat. I sand just so I can see the black guide coat on the edges of the putty, and that pretty much tells me that I haven't sanded too much of the putty away. There are some spots that are still going to require some touch up here, a few other spots as well. But overall not bad. The fuselage turned out pretty good, except for the back here I had some pretty big divots. The wing, yeah, I used a lot of putty here. I did not do a very good job with matching up the sheeting with the leading edge. There's a nice trough running right along the entire length on both sides, top and bottom. So I didn't do a very good job with that. A little disappointing. And then the flight controls, they're okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about this green acryl, the 3M acryl green, I guess it's called, putty versus the Bondo. This acryl green, I actually like it. Now it takes more sanding effort to sand than the Bondo. The Bondo sand's really easy, but because of that, it's actually easier to not remove too much of the green acryl green, than the Bondo. If you sand too much away the Bondo, then you got to apply another layer, another coat. You got to let it dry. You got to sand it again. So I think overall the time difference between the two is about the same. This one I was using initially 150 grit sandpaper to cut back the rough application of the putty, and then I switched to a 240 for final smoothing. And I did that the same with the Bondo. I didn't need the 150, I could go straight to the 240. But it sanded it so quickly that I think I'm going to have to go back in and add another application. So now it's time to add another coat of primer and look for any areas that require more putty. So yeah, it's going to take another fine tuning. Alright, it's time to put a second coat of primer on. As you can see, I'm using a red primer this time. Kind of a long story, I don't really need to bore you with it. Basically, the paint store that I went to before, the owner said that the manufacturer just does primer in red. Well, at the time, I hadn't discovered a paint store where I get the gray from, so I bought the red. Then I discovered the gray paint store that had the gray primer, so I never used this red. But most of this is going to be sanded off anyway, and then the final coat of primer before paint will be in gray. I was running low on my gray stock, and that store is about 3 hours away round trip, so I didn't want to get partway through this and run out of the gray and have to wait to go to that paint store. That store is also in the area where the RC store is, so I'd like to kill a couple of birds with that one round trip if I can. So anyway, long story short, I'm going to try to get rid of this red primer. It's fairly thick in the pan, but I did soak the roller in thinner. That's why it probably looks a little bit on the thin side. And I should have removed most of that excess lacquer thinner from the roller before putting it in the paint. The second coat of red primer has been pretty much sanded off. I was able to get a lot of that red primer off of the flight controls, for the most part, so they don't look too bad. And the fuselage and the wing, though, I left a lot of the red primer on. I think they're going to need a little bit of work. But I'm ready to put a third coat of primer on. Like I said, they're still not quite yet fully, all the imperfections have not been filled. But I'm at the stage now where I'm ready to work on fillets and doors, landing gear doors, main cabin entry door, the inlet and exhaust nacelles that fit on both sides of the aft fuselage, and then of course the aft cowl. After I get all that installed, then I'll go ahead and do the final preparation of the surface before putting the windows in. So let me go ahead and get a third coat of primer on now, and this will be a red primer also. Alright, so the flight controls have got their second coat of red primer, and I've noticed a little bit of a problem. Getting a little bit of cracking in the primer. This happened on the first coat of red primer I put on, and that was fairly thick, so I thought maybe the primer was too thick. So this time I thinned it 60-40, 60% primer, 40% thinner. The thinner is just lacquer thinner. Let's go outside and I'll show you the fuselage. But this time it was pretty thin. And the fuselage here, the bottom, it had a lot of cracking. And then off camera I went back and applied another coat of primer. And just a couple of cracks have shown up. Same here. Now, after the second coat of primer, I'm not seeing any cracks here. And then in the wing, I've got some right here. So I don't know if this is the primer reacting with the putty underneath, or if the primer is too thick. I mean, I'm using the lacquer thinner, which, you know, flashes off very quickly. The paint store said that was the appropriate paint, thinner for the paint, for the primer. Looking back on this, I think I just left too much lacquer thinner in the roller brush. All that excess lacquer reacted with the lacquer putty underneath the primer, creating the cracks. In preparation for making up some fiberglass parts, I went ahead and gave this, I guess it was the second coat of red primer, rub back just a little bit, just enough to smooth out the primer. I need to have smooth areas where I'm going to have a barrier, either a clear plastic covering barrier or clear packing tape. Either way, it needs to have a smooth surface for that stuff, you know, to really stick down good. And so, areas I'm going to start working on, I need to make a wing fairing here back to about the middle of the fuselage here. And I need to make a cabin entry door right here. And then up underneath, I need to start working on the belly pan and the landing gear doors. That's all kind of one and the same thing. And then some nose gear doors as well. In addition to making the fiberglass parts, I also need to work on getting these intake and exhaust nacelles in place. It's going to take a little bit of trimming to get a good fit.